Okay, it is 7 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. This is the China Business Essentials webinar, and this is the first one. And we're going to talk about the number one self-inflicted cause of dysfunctional partnerships in China. All right. So, what I'm going to do today, again, my name is Gene. Okay. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to walk you through the three phases of developing winning partnerships in China. So hopefully you are attending this webinar because you have some business or you have some interest in China. And what I'm going to talk about is the number one most critical thing that everybody encounters, and that's basically developing winning partnerships. Okay. So it's important to really understand that understanding how to develop successful partnerships in China really is a microcosm of all things that you will do in China. Now, I'm going to qualify this, but I'm saying that from a perspective of a non-Chinese and from the perspective of an American, the cultural differences between American or the United States, which is where I'm from, and China are really, really vast. And a lot of people who go to China and do business, they encounter a lot of things that either creates frustrations or it creates disappointments, or basically they're not able to achieve the outcomes that they expect. And partnering is basically a way to understand how not only to develop successful partnerships, but also to develop successful businesses in all facets of what you're going to do in China. Okay. So there are three fundamental phases when you are developing partnerships, and that is to negotiate, to align, and to maintain. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through these three phases as if you were negotiating or preparing to enter into a partnership in China. And, and the goal is for you to really understand the nuances of how it's different than what you might normally expect. Okay, so the first question that I always ask with my clients who are doing business in China is who or what is to blame for bad partners? Okay, so bad partners, what do we mean by bad partners? So, in our minds, when I say our, again, it's from the American point of view, bad partners are people who are corrupt or unethical. And it could be partners that are just kind of, you think they're deceptive, they're dishonest, and they're misleading. Okay. And the point that I really want to try to get across is that when you first visit China and you're in this kind of honeymoon period, you will notice that everybody in China is really, really nice, really, really accommodating, and really, really passionate and enthusiastic with working with you as a foreigner trying to do business in China. And what happens over time is we start to experience a lot of these behaviors that we think are quote unquote bad. And what I want everybody to really understand is that um, partners actually become bad, but they weren't born that way. So the answer to this question from the things that I'm going to teach you is that you are the number one cause, or you are to blame for the poor behavior of the partnerships that you are trying to develop in China. And through this webinar, I'm going to really help you understand the cultural nuances of why certain things that you think are just normal behavior actually will cause you a lot of challenges and issues further on down the line. Because our basic premise is that if you want to be successful in China, or if you want to crush it in China, as we always talk about, you really have to understand, how do I take ownership of my own behavior and how I act and behave and communicate and negotiate in China. And then I'm also going to show you what are the controllable levers to really affect the outcomes that you desire. And the outcomes should really always be a win-win situation. And what we're going to really show you or demonstrate is that these outcomes you have levers that are 100% controllable by you to affect the outcomes that you're going to achieve. And most people, when they go to China, they don't really understand how to affect or influence these outcomes and how to change the perceptions of people that they're working with. Okay? So, our goal is really to help you understand how to get from point A to point B. Okay? So, everybody's point B might be different, but you really have to imagine what is the final outcome that you hope to achieve when you are entering into partnerships in China. Okay. It should be something like it's a predictable, sustainable success. Okay. And the problem is achieving a predictable and sustainable success in China isn't something that anyone can give you with an answer. Okay. There's no answer that says, okay, this is what you do in order to achieve sustainable success through your partnerships in China. It actually requires developing three things in parallel that we're going to talk about. We're going to touch on a little bit about it in this webinar, but it's basically about understanding what I call the three pillars of transformational success. And this is actually module 1 of a course that I am just now launching. It's called 6 Essential Steps to Crush It in China. Okay. And the three pillars that we talk about in module 1 are basically, how do I develop a mindset for China business? And what does that mean? How do I develop the essential soft skills that matter, that really help me understand what people think and how they behave, and even more importantly, how we are perceived in the eyes of other people? And the final thing you want to develop is a mastery of cross-cultural performance. And that's basically affecting the outcomes you want to achieve through the perceptions of other people. In today's example, where we're just talking about partnering, we're really going to just talk about certain things that are related to a mindset for China business. Okay, so some people are clicking in late. So we're really just getting started. You really haven't missed anything yet. Today's webinar is really talking about how to avoid dysfunctional partnerships in China, and how preventing dysfunctional partnerships or creating win-win partnerships is actually 100% within your control. And what we're going to do today is we're really going to start helping you to develop the mindset for China business and really understand what are the dichotomies in my current way of thinking, and why does my current way of thinking not work when I go to China and try to develop these partnerships. Okay, so we start with phase 1 of kind of how we envision when we go to form partnerships in China. And phase 1 is pretty simple. It's negotiations. Okay, so whenever we are preparing for negotiations or getting ready to find partners that we want to work with, we always have to kind of ask ourselves, what is the primary purpose of these meetings and of these negotiations? Okay, so typically what happens is that when Americans or foreigners or Westerners go over to China and they start to negotiate with their Chinese counterparts, they think, well, the primary purpose of negotiations is actually to come to some form of agreement. Okay, and whatever we agree upon, we want to get it signed. We want to have a contract. And the contract basically is the outcome of our negotiations. It's basically what we agree as partners that we're going to do, we're going to be responsible for, and what we're going to contribute to the partnership. Okay. And this is the mindset that most people would enter into negotiations with. Okay. Now, when you go to China, it's not as explicit as it's going to sound in a presentation, but basically in China, for the typical Chinese mindset, the negotiation process is really more about developing this term that you have all heard before, and it's called Guanxi. Okay. And Guanxi, the outcome of that is the mutual trust between people who are going to work together. So fundamentally, when we start, if your primary purpose is to actually agree on the terms of the agreement, even though you're still assessing the partnership and assessing the compatibility, the fit, the synergies, and all that stuff, it's different. The mindset is different than what the Chinese are really doing. The Chinese are really just looking at developing the Guanxi and understanding whether there can be a mutual trust. Okay, and what happens is when two people have opposing views of what the purpose of negotiations is, and this is in phase one, then the result is it leads to a lot of unexpected disappointments. And in the further modules and the further training, we talk about something called the China leadership dilemma. And China leadership dilemmas, or CLDs, are basically the unexpected disappointments that we encounter when we use our standard modus operandi or our standard approach for communications, for leadership, for partnering, for whatever. And then we don't get the outcomes we expect. And we think that we've done everything right. And that's basically the China leadership dilemma that we'll talk more about throughout a lot of the training and the courses that we have. Okay. So if you think about the mindset that you have when you enter into an agreement or a partnership, okay, if you really care more about the terms of the agreement, what's signed on the contract or what's signed on the paper, what happens is I believe that you're capping your maximum ROI. And let me explain that in a very, very simple story. Okay, so I have my wife, who I met about 7 or 8 years ago. When she was my girlfriend, before Christmas or before Valentine's Day, she used to ask me, "What are you going to get me as a gift for Christmas?" Okay. And I would always respond that it's a surprise. I want to get you a surprise. And she would always say, "I don't want a surprise because I'm afraid you're going to give me something that I don't want." Okay. But what ended up happening is every time it was a surprise, it was something unexpected. It was something that actually exceeded her expectations, and she was pleasantly surprised. Okay. When you put restrictions as in an agreement, what that is actually doing is that is capping your maximum ROI. Because what happens in the partnership is you start to think more about reacting and enforcing the terms of the partnership, making sure your Chinese partners are living up to what they agreed upon, as opposed to collaborating. Okay, so these are really subtle nuances in your mindset. And this is one of the things that we really talk about in becoming a master of cross-cultural performance. It's really, how do you make the proper adjustments to your own attitude, mindset, and approach in order to crush it in China, or in order to develop more successful Guanxi relationships or partnerships or whatever it is. So this is one of the elements that we really get into in our training, is really understanding the nuances of how we think and how that actually affects the long-term trajectory of what you are trying to do or what you might be trying to do in Asia, okay, so, or in China. So one of the things that a lot of people encounter when they're negotiating or when they're meeting people and they're trying to figure out, can we work together, can we become partners, is a lot of people in China will encounter what feels like non-committal posturing. Okay, so you're having a lot of great dinners, you're having a lot of great conversations, you're building a lot of great chemistry, but you keep on feeling that your Chinese partners are kind of non-committal. Okay, so what I want to highlight here and why that happens is the general Western approach to partnerships is something that actually kind of defeats what you're trying to accomplish in China. And let me try to explain that in this slide. So what happens is most people believe that when I'm entering into a partnership agreement, when I'm meeting people who are candidates to become my partner, I want to be as transparent as possible. And I've encountered this so many times with people going to China and then complaining to me. And they just basically say, our approach is to be as transparent as possible. We give them all the information, everything that we can do, and we believe that's the best approach, is just to not leave any surprises. Okay. And what you're going to experience on the back end is that the Chinese people seem to be a lot more vague. And being vague isn't that there are language barriers, but it's just they are non-committal and they're kind of vague. Okay. So let me put this into a cultural context for you. Okay. And why being totally transparent may cause a disadvantage in the negotiations. Okay. It's basically, it has to do with the art of war. Okay. Everybody's heard of the art of war, but nobody really understands how Chinese people employ the art of war. And I want to just describe one phenomenon or one thing that you're going to experience in China. And that's basically when you are talking to people, when you're communicating, when you're negotiating, you almost have to have the mindset that the people that you're communicating with in China, they're not going to say what they mean and they're not going to mean what they say. Okay. Now you got to think about that for a minute. When people in China don't say what they mean and don't mean what they say, that's not a negative. That's not to say that they're deceitful, they're dishonest, they're disingenuous. It's cultural. Okay. It has to do with a mindset for China business where Chinese people generally want to give face and they want to receive face. And that by definition is actually to be disingenuous, to say something that you may or may not really mean. So if you really want to understand the nuances of communicating in China, you have to understand that Chinese are not doing it deliberately to be deceitful. They're doing it because that's how they communicate. And in the art of war, if you are there being transparent and every time you're in a next round of negotiations or dinner, you're just giving more information, more information, more information, the Chinese people are just going to let you keep on talking because every time you are giving more information, you're giving value to them in exchange for nothing in return. And that's why you are frustrated. And that's why you feel that Chinese people are non-committal in this negotiation phase. You think that they're deliberately vague, but it's really cultural. So the advice really is you gotta have to know the game and play the game, which is, it's not to not be transparent, but it's to really be selectively transparent. There are certain things where you should be deliberately vague, because if you're not, you will just basically be providing your people that you're negotiating with more value in exchange for nothing in return. Okay. And this has to do with the Chinese concept of time, where Chinese people are generally more patient in this regard. Now, the things that you may perceive is that they're very anxious, they're very enthusiastic, they want to get going. But in this negotiations, they're actually really patient. And that's why you get a lot of quote unquote non-committal posturing. And this also relates to this whole concept of linear thinking versus circular thinking. So we as Americans or we as Westerners, we think more in a linear fashion. There's a cause and there's an effect, cause and effect. There's a progression from step A to step B to step C, and we have a roadmap on how things develop. You have to imagine that when their logic and their reasoning is circular, they don't process things in a linear fashion. And the result is they're much more emotional about what they feel. And that is also why sometimes being vague, deliberately vague, is going to actually help you in your negotiations. Okay. So once you understand kind of this initial phase of why we're entering the negotiations, and it's not really about getting the contract signed as much as it is about developing the Guanxi, then you start to think about, okay, well, how do I achieve the alignment? And the question that a lot of people ask is, well, what is the most important thing to align when selecting partners in China? Okay. And a lot of people will say that you should align on values. Okay. Because they believe that once you align on values, then it's much easier to communicate as you move forward. Okay. This is something that, from my experience, I have, over 15 years of experience working in China, leading partnerships and working with multinational companies and even working with state-owned enterprises, that you really want to focus on process. So aligning on process is a lot more important than aligning on value. Okay, so why do we say that? Okay, it comes back to just culturally how the Chinese communicate. Okay, so in the earlier statement, we basically said that uh, Chinese people, by no fault of their own, generally don't say what they mean and they don't mean what they say. It's not just ingenuous, it's not being deceitful, it's just cultural. Okay, so aligning on values is almost impossible because, number one, it's unlikely that somebody who was born and raised in China would share the same values as somebody that was born and raised in my case, in Atlanta, Georgia. Okay, it just wouldn't happen because these two worlds are completely dichotomous. Okay, uh, but you have to understand that the way Chinese people communicate, because of this system of giving and receiving face, and the way that culturally, the way that they're they're aligned, is that generally they're going to tell you what you want to hear, or they're going to tell you what they believe will create the maximum advantage for them. This is cultural. This is not being deceitful. Okay, so you have to understand, trying to align on values is almost a hopeless cause because you're not going to be able to differentiate what you are hearing between what they are actually thinking, which is what results in the China leadership dilemmas further on down the road. Something starts off very promising and then it slowly deteriorates and it slowly disintegrates. If you think about aligning on process, you make it more about business as opposed to about culture. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that actions mean more than words. When you're in the negotiation process, if you are sometimes deliberately vague, but you're very specific on certain deliverables or certain requirements or certain milestones, then basically you're aligning on process as opposed to aligning on values. And this is something that will help you tremendously in your negotiations. It'll help expedite them, and it will also help you kind of filter out who is a worthy partner and who is not. Because now it's more about action than it is about just what people say. Because what people say really has no meaning and no value in the context of understanding what is actually going on. And this is something that we talk about a lot in our um, Crushing in China course, is really about perceptions and misperceptions. It's not only understanding your own misperceptions, but it's also understanding how you are perceived by the Chinese person or somebody on the other side in the context of the business environment and of the situation. Okay, so the final phase of dysfunctional partnerships or negotiating partnerships in China is really, how do you maintain the partnership or the relationship? And this is really one of the nuances of understanding this very kind of term that gets overused and thrown around, is Chinese Guanxi, and understanding that in context is to really understand that um, for Westerners, as we said in the beginning of the presentation, the negotiation ends when the contract is signed. Okay. Now, for the Chinese, the negotiation begins after the contract is signed. So, how do you reconcile that? Now, this isn't a literal description. This is more of a reality of how people think and why ultimately certain partnerships and certain relationships go bad. Because in Chinese culture, Guanxi is something that you must foster and facilitate throughout the life of the partnership. It doesn't end when the contract is signed. If you want to develop successful partnerships in China, you have to think about the entire trajectory of, well, Chinese business, which is the system of reciprocity. Okay, Guanxi is based on a system of reciprocity. It's based on the continual exchange of goodwill. And the goodwill, a lot of misperceptions is they think the exchange of goodwill is giving money and doing corrupt activities. No, it's not. Especially now between Chinese and foreigners, Chinese don't expect foreigners to give money anymore. They're looking for something more. They're looking for face, they're looking for goodwill, they're looking for reciprocity, they're looking for acknowledgement, they're looking for involvement, they're looking for opportunities. And this applies not only to partnerships, but this applies to leadership. If you're leading Chinese employees, there is also a guanxi and a continual exchange of reciprocity. Okay, so if you look at this diagram and understand the differences between how Westerners and how Chinese approach negotiations, if you follow this trajectory and you understand the mindset for China business and you know how to foster guanxi relationships, then you can develop a win-win. Okay, what happens is you don't continue to foster the guanxi, develop the guanxi, and exchange the goodwill after the contract is signed. And this is what leads to quote unquote partnerships going bad or partnerships becoming dysfunctional. And what happens is Chinese people are very, very clever and they're very, very smart. And when you are doing business in their home country, this is where you really have to understand how important the guanxi is. Because what happens is Chinese people are clever. They're always going to get what they think they rightfully deserve. Okay, now we're not going to debate what's fair and what's not fair, but we just have to understand that all of the quote unquote bad behavior happens when you stop thinking about the guanxi relationship over time. And the result of that is something that I call goodwill extraction. Because one thing that we as foreigners, we can never have insight into is the entire end-to-end ecosystem or the entire value chain of doing business in China. And what happens is, if the Chinese people feel that you're not caring enough about the relationship or they're being treated unfairly, or you're using your leverage to force them into unfavorable positions, you may not really know about it, but what's going to happen is they're going to start extracting their goodwill out of other parts of the value chain. And this is what we as Westerners start to feel as, okay, this is corrupt behavior, this is unethical behavior, this is bad behavior. But what we don't realize is a lot of times that bad behavior is caused by our lack of understanding of what is actually necessary to maintain a successful partnership. Okay, so this is kind of a very broad overview of some very nuanced things of you may not have thought of when you're doing your business partnerships in China. Okay, so let me summarize real quick what we talked about today. So partnering in China, what we talked about today was really the tip of the iceberg of understanding what it means to develop a mindset for China business. Of course, it's understanding how to develop guanxi relationships in the context of Chinese business culture. It's the understanding how important the continual exchange of goodwill and reciprocity is. And in more detail, we should talk about what does it mean to actually give and receive face, and how do you cause people to lose face, and how important that is over the life cycle of your partnership. Okay, so don't think of your partnership as just getting the contract signed, because if you only think about it that way, you're actually capping your maximum ROI and you're reacting to problems that you anticipate as opposed to collaborating to achieve greater win-win outcomes further on down the road. Okay. All of this is something that I want to talk about is I'm recently launching a course. It's called the 6 Essential Steps to Crush It in China. And this is kind of what I'm going to share with everybody in this webinar. So module 1, obviously, is the 3 pillars for transformational success. Understanding how to develop a mindset for China business, understanding how to develop the essential soft skills that matter, and how to develop a mastery of what we call cross-cultural performance. And we'll get into all of that. Okay, and then we get into the Guanxi engine. So the Guanxi is basically, we call it an engine because basically everything that you do in China runs on understanding the nuances of Chinese Guanxi. Perceptions and misperceptions is really the cause of a lot of your China leadership dilemmas, or CLDs. Developing the essential soft skills that matter, becoming a master of cross-cultural performance in the context of doing business in China, and of course, what is going to be your new modus operandi? How are you going to change your own behavior, which is 100% controllable by you, to be able to foster successful Guanxi relationships and eventually to be able to crush it in China? Okay, so this is basically the course that we are offering. Okay, so I think I need to move this screen of mine. So I also did a Mindset for China Business webinar, and in the last module, I gave everybody a coupon code. I wasn't sure how I was going to use this coupon code, but basically it's ESSTM. It stands for Essential Soft Skills That Matter. This is my first online course, so I really didn't know how to price it. So the price is definitely going to go up. Right now it's $99, but with the coupon code ESSTM, you're basically going to get it for $27. Okay. And then I'm going to give a lot of bonuses. So I basically made CLD Nation a Facebook group, just a closed private group of people who are taking the course. And every week, we're going to have live office hours. So basically, it's going to be a Zoom session, and anybody who wants to ask questions, anybody wants to talk about their training, anybody wants to ask questions about the things that they're encountering in China, they're going to be able to do that every week in the live business hours in the Facebook group. You're going to get this, I think it's 17 or 18 pages. It's called the Definitive Guide to Cross-Cultural Performance Mastery. You're going to get that guide. And these modules, in addition to the 6 modules that we talked about, I'm going to be doing these kind of free webinars that I talk about some aspect of doing business in China. And you may not be able to attend them all live, but all of the replays will be recorded and they'll be posted as bonus modules in your library when you register for this course. So this library that you're going to get for $27 is going to get more valuable over time. I'm just getting started. So we're just going to continue to put content into these modules. Okay. And also, I want to try to get to know a few students in the beginning more personally, because it really helps me to understand what your real challenges are. So I can do webinars about your specific challenge. So if you sign up within the next 24 hours, I'm going to send you a personal link with a Calendly scheduling link where we will do a one-on-one Zoom session. Okay, so if you're actually taking this course, it's great that you're taking the course, but having a one-on-one session with me will basically help you understand in context how all the pieces fit together and how you can get the most out of this, and eventually how you're going to be able to crush it in China. Okay, so what we're going to do now is, what we're going to do now is we're going to do Q&A. You can ask me any questions about doing business in China. You can ask me any questions about partnering in China, or you can ask me any questions about this course. So I am going to stop the share screen, and I see a lot of familiar faces on there. So if you want to ask a question, just unmute yourself and Yes, Dolores, go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, Jean. You know that in the business that I am forming at the time, the original concept for me was to do apparel. What is the best method in sourcing, like a group to work with in China, or how do you start that? I know that most manufacturing for apparel is done there, more particularly the caps that I'm looking for. How would this help me?
Okay, so you're looking for a supplier or a vendor in China.
Yes.
Okay, so this is really, it's really, I don't want to say it's tricky, but the way that somebody in your situation would do that is because you don't speak Chinese and you're starting off kind of like as a small entrepreneur.
Mm-hmm.
Your key is to find the right intermediary.
Okay.
Everybody who sells products in the US on Amazon, on eBay, on their own e-commerce store, when they source in China, whether they're doing white label products or private label products or whatever, they always have to go through an intermediary. Even me, I speak Chinese. If I wanted to source products in China, I would have to find an intermediary because I'm never going to fly to China, go to the factory, negotiate with the factory, audit the factory. I'm never going to do that. I'm always going to have to use an intermediary. So it's not just an intermediary who can translate for you. What you need to do, and this is why what we talked about today is appropriate, you want to find an intermediary that can negotiate on your behalf, because you're going to have a lot of requirements that need to be effectively communicated to the factory. Certain quality standards, certain delivery standards, certain material specifications. There's a lot of details that you will need to find the right partner to help you source the right thing. And one of the things that you really want to do is in the beginning, you want to kind of gauge how many options you are given. What you want to try to avoid is you want to try to avoid an intermediary who's working directly with the factory and they're kind of presenting a face to you, and they're actually kind of, you know, you're actually representing the factory more than they're representing you.
Yeah.
So one of the ways to gauge that is that you're given multiple options in different regions. And that's just a tell sign that they are actually really trying to look for the right partner that might be able to help you.
Hey, Gene, thanks for taking my question. I'm loving this so far. You're saying a lot of really interesting things. I think everyone who's been in the U.S. Thinks about how they can get products from China, like what Dolores was saying.
Yeah.
So just to Dolores's question, you said find an intermediary. That's your best bet?
It's not your best bet. It's almost your only bet.
Okay. How?
Because so even when you go online, you do a search and you're trying to source products, all of those are portals to intermediaries. Okay. So even if you're starting from nothing and you just type in, source from China or find a jacket supplier from China, you're going to start getting different types of organizations with a different type of presence. You can start to initiate a conversation. You can make an inquiry. There's a lot of portals and a lot of websites that do that. Some organizations are much larger, so you may get assigned an agent. Some of them are just freelancers like us, and they have their own website, and they're trying to connect with buyers overseas. So, so if you're sourcing products, it's just basically understanding how to ask the right questions and how to narrow down your search. That's the most difficult part, because the thing that you have to keep in mind is in the initial conversations that you have, once you've made an inquiry, let's say you submitted an inquiry through some kind of website. Yeah. Everybody is going to be telling you what they think you want to hear, and everybody's going to be promising you that they can deliver exactly what you want. But what happens is when the rubber meets the road, you end up being disappointed because what you're going to find is you're going to find things change. And that's the most frustrating things most Americans have doing business with China, because we think very literally and we think very linearly. So we say, okay, if you told us this, how come now it's changed? And then what you're going to get is you're going to get this long-winded explanation of, well, we didn't expect that you would want this, and then now suddenly this and this and this. So what you want to do is you want to avoid that. And one of the ways to do that is to be more vague with what you want and force them to take more action with what they can deliver. And that is the misconception that a lot of Americans or foreigners negotiating with China actually have, is they don't understand the nuances of actually how Chinese people communicate and why they say the things that they say.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Renzo.
No, I just want to share my experience.
Okay.
As you know, I am in the tech industry.
Okay.
I am a partner from Cisco, that
Okay.
is big titan of technology, and also from Huawei. I don't know how you pronounce Huawei.
Yeah, Huawei.
The other titan, no?
Yeah.
And now this webinar for me was really great, because really Cisco and Huawei, they have two really different ways of works, no? And with Huawei, for me, sometimes it's difficult because they are vague about, as you told, and you say, oh, okay, this switch or this server, or I don't know, the specification, and they say, okay, they do that, this specification, the data sheet, but we can do another things, no? And there are little this bag, no? And in when you go deeper in the data sheet and the specification, you have to be very specific. And okay, Cisco is okay. I have this 20 specifications, and with Huawei, they are vague about how do you say, I don't know in English, but they are clear, but not so much clear. Then I start to understand. For me, this was grateful about learning your webinar, because sometimes I suffer with Huawei, no?
Well, you're not the only one. I think everybody suffers with that when they're doing business in China. So obviously, Huawei and Cisco are basically leaders in this kind of telecommunications infrastructure equipment. The reality is there's a lot of political issues going on with Huawei. Okay, so between the United States and a lot of other governments, we seem to be concerned that the technology embedded in Huawei servers may include some kind of way to spy on the data that's going through. Now, that's all, there's no proof of that, so we don't really know if that's true or not, but it is a political issue now. So
no, but I work in Mexico. I know that in the United States they have this problem, but in Mexico it's open, no? We can work without problem with Huawei and with Cisco.
yeah,
And,
no,
and I,
no.
and
What happens if your companies are using Huawei networking equipment, you may not be able to work with the US companies. That's the problem. You can buy it in Mexico, but depending on what's going to happen with this negotiation, I mean, the United States and China are in the middle of this negotiations. And there's kind of like a 90-day kind of ceasefire in this trade war. So the tariffs are not going to be raised to 25%. This is happening in Argentina now with the G20 summit. What's going to happen in 90 days? Nobody knows. So, but your point is just individually, when you're communicating with Cisco versus communicating with Huawei, it's going to be a completely different experience.
Yeah. And I have this experience, no, that different culture, and for me it was really helpful listening to you.
Yeah. So in your case, I want to give you a little, because I work in manufacturing. I did 10 years of manufacturing in China, working with product development teams, auditing factories. Basically, I was an engineer with an MBA degree who can speak Chinese, run around in China working with all these companies and factories. So when you're talking about technology companies and you're already working together, then with Chinese companies, you have to be extra specific. Okay. When I'm talking about negotiating partnerships where you want to be vague, that's before you're working together. If you're already working with somebody in China, you have to be extra specific on the specifications, because what happens is if there's any ambiguity in the specifications, it's likely that the manufacturing partner will take the cheaper route and you are going to get an inferior product, or there are going to be quality steps that are taken out so they can save on the manufacturing costs. Some materials, if they're not specified properly, you could get an inferior material. There's all kinds of things that can happen on the factory. So in partnerships, when I talk about people getting what they're due in the value chain, I call it goodwill extraction. In manufacturing, it's called quality fade. And that means you think the specifications are set, and then what you're going to find is 1 year, 2 years later, hey, suddenly I'm getting a higher rate of return. I'm starting to get a higher defect rate. Okay. That is also because you're not auditing the factory enough, and you're not auditing the factory with the right people. I mean, what you want to avoid is you want to avoid somebody going to the factory and they just take them through a walkthrough and they don't really know where all the cracks are. And then because you can't figure out from that kind of audit where people might be kind of skimping on materials or cutting out steps. So the audit is, the factory audit in China is really, really a tricky thing. But what you really want to do on the front end is you actually want to be very, 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 very specific on the specifications and the requirements and get sign off on that and talk about the steps that you will be auditing, right? And then you need to try to figure out how you can get real-time reporting, tie that into some type of ERP, and you can get real-time data on that if you're doing kind of large B2B business. It's just tricky. It's tricky. I understand exactly what you're going through, Renzo.
No. Yeah. I start to understand better.
Well, good. I'm glad you guys are starting to understand better. Thank you for coming. I'm happy to just continue talking. I mean, you guys, it doesn't have to be about China. I mean, go ahead, Daniel.
Just quick question. Sorry, Dolores. Will you go through the 6 steps of the course? Can you do that?
Do that now?
Because like, so you mentioned being vague in negotiations. Is that correct? And then be specific once you've made a partnership on when it comes to actual specifications. This is after the sort of handshake deal or contract has been signed.
Yeah. So this is where it's really nuanced. So you actually have to develop what I call the essential soft skills that matter. So what is that? One is you have to be able to develop empathy for what the Chinese people value and what they prioritize. And you have to develop 3 types of awareness. You have to develop self-awareness, which is understanding how you are perceived by the people you're negotiating with beyond what you're hearing them say. You have to develop cultural awareness, so you understand why certain things work or don't work in the context of doing business in China. And you have to develop situational awareness, understanding what the leverage and the bargaining power is, understanding what the macro constraints are, understanding what the regulatory environment is, understanding what the legal context is. There's a bunch of stuff that you needed to develop. When you're negotiating, it's just kind of like a rule of thumb that if you start to feel that your partners seem to be non-committal and you seem to be giving them all this information, then you want to take a step back. Am I giving too much information? Am I putting myself at a disadvantage? Am I not driving action? Right? This is the slide that I had where it's basically saying that either you're working in a cultural environment and you're at a disadvantage because you don't understand how to navigate that culture and how people communicate, or you take control and you make it more action oriented. So that's where you want to align on process as opposed to align on values. And if you're aligning on process, then everything is easier to really understand because it's all about, okay, this is the next step to demonstrate your goodwill, as opposed to, well, tell me what you think. You know, this is kind of what we are, right? It's very nuanced and it takes a lot of experience to really be able to do it right. And the only thing that it helps you with now, if you have no experience in China, is it helps you understand, why is my partner so non-committal? Why does it seem that I'm sharing everything, I'm being 100% transparent, but I can't seem to get a straight answer? Well, I'm telling you why. All right, Dolores, you had to jump in?
Sure. I was going to ask another question. What are your thoughts on using as a intermediary or someone to help you find your agent overseas? How about customs brokers or freight forwarding companies? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well,
because they're usually well connected.
What's that?
Because they're usually so well connected with the various manufacturers of all the shipping. Yeah.
So the well-connected piece, that's a double-edged sword.
Oh, you're right.
Right. That's a double-edged sword. So the freight forwarders and all of that stuff, the shipping companies, I think that's the second step. What the first step, if you're going in completely brand new and you don't have any connections, you're just going to have to go through a process of interviews. Okay. You're going to have to basically, you can even exaggerate a little bit what your annual spend or what your requirements would be. That's okay. And you want to basically just send out kind of like a very, very time-saving for you, a very time-saving RFQ. Let different people bid on your contract or give you ideas on what they can or cannot do. And then what you want to do is you want to take one big cut and immediately reject the people that you know cannot give you what you want, because it all comes down to being efficient with your time. Because what happens is if you get into these endless negotiations, it can just drain your time and you're never doing work and you're never making sales. So you have to take that first slice, send out these RFQs, find out if they understand even what you're asking, right? Because you can put in the RFQ, I need this, I need to make sure this, and my customers or our market requires this. Can you find something like this? And just look at the response, right? You should be able to intuitively know, does this intermediary or does this organization or this person kind of understand a little bit about what I want? And if the answer is they don't understand anything, then you just kind of need to move on, right? It's always advisable to try to make those cuts as quick as possible, because what ends up happening is it gets really, really time consuming, this negotiation process.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So what you want to do is you want to try to filter as many as you can in that first cut, and then really get into specific type of questions. And again, you're going to have to find the right balance between transparency and vagueness, because ultimately your goal is to drive action, right? Driving action on the other part, right? It's almost like, once I understand what you can do in this regard, it's easier for me to give you more information in this regard, instead of giving everything up front and just waiting for them to give you an answer, right? You want to almost kind of like give them enough to where they want to bid, and then kind of save the valuable information as an exchange of goodwill. Okay, demonstrate this, I can give you this. Don't say it literally, but kind of develop that understanding that they don't get information from you until they provide something that valuable for you, as far as more insights, deeper understanding into kind of the different choices and stuff like that. It's really kind of know the game, play the game is really important about this aspect of doing business in China. Right.
I had just very little interaction when I was at the oil and gas company with CNOC when they would come to do tours, because they had a joint venture with the company I was with, and those were the most the save face, give face. I think that was learned in that learning curve quite a bit. I think we it was, the VPs at one point, you always have to have the highest people that you possibly can have there. Very, absolutely. And then the rest of it was just, they were inundated with PowerPoints till the cows came home. And I think what they really wanted was to go out and see the sites, the pad sites, the actual operations. And that was probably, you could tell that's when, in everyone's eyes, that was the show to give. And I think that was what was more effective in that particular circumstance. But, it is that give, safe, and give face, save face. They were never disrespectful. Like, I'm so tired of your 101 slides of PowerPoint, because there's you have you're an engineer, the litany of engineers that are going to tell them what their bazillion dollars that they have invested in this particular play is. They're going to want to know. Somebody back home is going to want to know what's going on with their money. But at the end of the day, I think it was a very unique circumstance to see the absolute politeness, like you put the epitome of being polite is a Chinese businessman representing the government, in my opinion.
Yeah, so I've actually done consulting at on-site consultant at a Chinese state-owned enterprise. For me, it was Sinopec, also a large Chinese state-owned enterprise. So Chinese state-owned enterprises are at the extreme of what we call the traditional Chinese mindset, because they're directly connected with the government. They deal in a system of hierarchical command and control, very hierarchical organization where people rise through the ranks through their Guanxi connections and not through their abilities or their performance. It's a complete dichotomy with what we're accustomed to here. So orchestrating those meetings, it really requires an understanding of how Chinese people think. I'll just give you an example. Here, I'm in this leads group, and there's this lawyer who does wills and trusts. I'm here in Southern California. So there's a lot of wealthy Chinese people here, and they need to have wills and trusts for their children who are doing in school here. And he's lost a lot of business with Chinese potential clients. And in his law firm, they have 2 or 3 people that are actually Chinese who speak Chinese. And even with those Chinese people translating, he wasn't able to close the business with these Chinese people. And because we're in the same leads group and we kind of have to do these one-on-ones, he said, hey, can you come to my law office? I have this potential client coming in. Can you come and kind of help facilitate that meeting? I said, sure. And so I know nothing about wills and trusts. And I was basically, so the guy was doing his name is George. He was kind of saying what he wanted to say, and then I would translate. But I would translate in a way that made the other person feel positive and feel good. And I want to make this long story short. We talked about all of the different aspects for about 90 minutes. And the Chinese gentleman basically says, at the end of our meeting, do I pay now? And this is what I always say to people who are doing business in China, who are kind of learning Chinese and saying, oh, you have such an advantage because you speak Chinese. The thing that I always say is, knowing how to speak Chinese doesn't mean you know what to say in Chinese. And that lawyer friend of mine, George, he wasn't even ready to take the business. He was like, oh no, well, we need to make sure you provide this, and I'll send you the contract and then you send it back to me or whatever. And the Chinese guy was like, do I pay now? He was ready to sign on board because I was there answering his questions in a way that made him feel good. I wasn't deceptive. I didn't say anything that was untrue, but it's just the way that you talk. It's very, very nuanced. And so this is kind of what I'm hoping to upsell people on. People who are taking my course, you know, it's $99 now, $27 with the discount, and I'm actually going to raise in 2 weeks. I'm doing another webinar. The price of this course is going up to $297, and then it's going to stick at that because I'm going to continue to add value to that. But the purpose is for me to upsell people on hiring me as a consultant, because that guy was just doing one deal with one client. But for a multinational company trying to negotiate with a Chinese state-owned enterprise, a multi-billion-dollar deal.
Easily.
You know,
Oh yeah, it's worth millions because, like I say, it boggles the mind, and we don't think of those terms as entrepreneurs at the onset. You only think of it you only think of it as like, oh, Exxon would only do business with there's so many people that are part of that funnel, because internally there's a lot of other things that have to get done. It's the world of consultancy, and you did an excellent program with it tonight, and I really do appreciate it. I think that for a person like myself, I originally began way back when, 1991 was when I graduated college, and I was very lucky that I had international sales, helped found an international sales department. How was that? That's a million years ago. I mean, that's truly a million years ago. So a lot of the things change, but some things still stay the same. Politeness is of utmost, and I don't care where I was in the world. And I think that's one of the things that we always have to constantly remember. And my last CNOC story is that, we do tours and things of that nature to the different sites. And, there was a lot of drilling going on, and that's a lot of action. But then you also have to recognize that they may not be here in your hometown or in the hometown where we were here. So you treat them with the utmost respect and courtesy, the nicest places you can afford to take them to. And also some of the more of the what was a lot of fun was seeing all these guys that were very, like you said, that bureaucracy and hierarchy. It's like they have never broken a plate in their life. And so, but to see them at Billy Bob's was a heck of another story.
Yeah.
It was fun. It was fun to see them be actual people versus not. I mean, they didn't go crazy or anything, but they let themselves go a little bit, and it was fun. I have to say those are some fun memories of that.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that things have changed a lot since you graduated. I mean, one of the things that has changed the most in the last 20 years is China. China has suddenly become basically the only other superpower in the world that can rival the United States. And China's trending upward, where I'm not really sure how America is trending. And China's influence on the global stage has basically unlocked a lot of the it's unlocked several things from the Chinese people. Some of it's good, some of it's bad. So it's unlocked their sense of entitlement, because in Chinese history, they've been subject to invasion and occupation and all of this stuff. And now Chinese people have become extremely, extremely nationalistic because of what they perceive their history is. And now that China's become strong, what that has translated to is it's translated into even greater arrogance when they're negotiating, even with Americans. 15 years ago, they would look up to Americans, and now it's almost like they look down to Americans. It's just become an extreme. And the key for us Americans is not to get offended by that and not to worry about that. Just understand it in the context of history, in the context of Chinese nationalism, and then just try to alter the conversation about, well, how do we work together? And through that process of communicating, how do I give the right amount of respect and right amount of face? And even if I have to be disingenuous and say things I don't really mean, well, who cares? Right? I mean, this is just...
I do that every day. I'm in marketing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, people take saying that to the extreme, and it's cultural. Yeah. So it's just really,
I
really...
was teasing.
Guanxi, can you explain that? I heard you use it, but I don't know what it means. I mean, I heard the first part of your webinar.
Oh, you mean Guanxi? Guanxi?
Yeah, Guanxi. Yeah.
Guanxi. Okay.
Yeah.
So Guanxi, if you literally translate it, it's just the relationship between two people. Okay. But in the Chinese cultural context, the relationship you have with someone else directly translates into what are the benefits you can extract from the relationship. And culturally, Chinese people expect that my benefit in this organization is going to be based on my Guanxi. Even if they know that we have KPIs and we're going to do performance reviews, and if you do well, you meet your sales targets, you're going to get a bonus. Culturally, in their mind, they're still going to feel that somehow their level of Guanxi will translate into how big that bonus is, or whether they can get that promotion or not. Okay. And the difference between a good personal relationship, so like in Texas, and even in the South, Georgia, where I'm from, we have this good old boy network. It's like we're brothers, and we have this Guanxi relationship. And we always want to look after our own. We want to help our brothers. We want to help our whatever. That's still very, very, very kind of insignificant compared to how important Guanxi is in China. Okay. We're talking about like fraternity brothers or sorority sisters. Yeah, we're going to help each other. We're going to give ourselves the opportunity. But ultimately, there's going to be a level of ethics in which we decide. Okay. In China, I'm not saying Chinese people are unethical, but I'm just saying that there's no such comparable system of ethics in them making their decisions. They will make their decisions almost based on the Guanxi relationship. Okay. And that is just hard for most Americans to really understand, because the way that they speak and the way that they talk and the things that they say will not lead you to believe how important Guanxi is. And that's the China leadership dilemma, because what happens is over time, you start to see people behaving poorly, and you start seeing people doing what you would consider corrupt and unethical things. And the reason that happens, in my thesis, is it's because you are not developing the Guanxi continuously. You're just expecting people to behave a certain way, and that doesn't work in China. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, one more question?
Yeah.
On the point you just made. How do we develop good Guanxi with partners in China?
Okay, so that's fundamentally the first thing you have to do is you have to, have you seen the movie Doctor Strange?
No.
Okay, so there's a statement in that movie where the master tells this person who's trying to enter this kind of training thing for the mystic arts that you have to forget everything you know to be true before you can enter. That is, when I saw that phrase in the movie, it's just the same as when you go to China. You first have to forget everything you know to be true, okay? All of your expectations of normal behavior and how people behave, throw that out the window, okay? And then to develop Guanxi relationships, you have to understand that Guanxi relationships fundamentally begins with giving and receiving face. That's why when you go to China for the very first time, you're in this, what I call honeymoon period. Everybody's lavishing you with gifts, lavishing you with compliments, wanting to take you out to dinner and do this and do that. Well, it's cultural, okay? What that does is that gives most people a false sense that, well, God, they're treating me like the king and they seem to agree with everything that I say. But that's where the China leadership dilemma happens, because actually, probably nobody agrees with what you say. They're just nodding their heads and they're being nice and they're smiling at you, okay? So when you go to China and you want to develop the Guanxi relationships, first is you want to understand how to play that game, okay? You want to understand how to give and receive. So you want to compliment people. You want to demonstrate goodwill. You want to make gestures. So you have to understand, what do you have of value that the Chinese people may want? And I mean, I'm not talking about money. You have access to recognition, to involvement, and to participation. Those are your weapons to develop Guanxi relationships, okay? When you go to China, you give people access to more information. That's why you don't give it all in the beginning, okay? You give them participation. For example, you're there on a business trip and you're there with all of your foreign colleagues, and a lot of times what happens is all the foreigners, they go out to dinner and they have their internal kind of dinners, and then the Chinese workers, they just go home. Well, if there's somebody in China that you think is really important to your success, you bring that person in, let that person participate in your, I used to work for a German company in China. Let that person participate in your all German cigar smoking or whatever like that, right? And the other thing is acknowledgement. There is nothing Chinese people like more than public acknowledgement from their foreign partner or foreign manager. There's nothing Chinese people like more than that acknowledgement, that praise, that acknowledgement. Do it openly. And the opposite is true. If you have something critical, don't do it in public. Pull them in private. And if you just follow those basic guidelines, that's the first step to developing Guanxi relationships.
Well, yeah. Well, go ahead and finish that. I was going to get your feedback on one of the places that I like to follow, and it's like I said, I began my career with import, export, manufacturing, so on and so forth. That was a million years ago. But one of the places that I find so interesting, because I still pay attention to all the ports and all the tonnage and all that kind of stuff, what I saw is a lot of the Chinese construction in Africa. And then, of course, with a lot of and of course, I'm in the energy sector, so I'm going to focus in on that. But I've seen all of this actual civil engineering going on by Chinese firms over in Africa. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, so you have to understand the long-term strategy of what the Chinese government is trying to do. Okay, and in more kind of developed Western nations, there's really not a lot of access for China to exert that type of influence. But in Southeast Asia and especially in Africa,
oh yeah,
which is the next frontier of energy and consumerism and all of that stuff, they're basically going in, and even in this kind of One Belt, One Road initiative, where they're building all of this infrastructure to connect China all the way down to, the Mediterranean. they're investing heavily in infrastructure, in energy, in construction projects, building highways, building roads, building high-speed rail, building telecommunications infrastructure. And they're doing it for political reasons. So, for example, in Africa, a lot of the countries in Africa initially recognized Taiwan and didn't recognize China. But now, slowly, a lot of these loyalties, they're giving up their recognition of Taiwan and they're switching over to China. So Taiwan now has fewer and fewer countries that actually recognize it as a country, right? So China is doing this basically as a indirect way of forcing concessions out of Taiwan. Instead of militarily going over and taking Taiwan by force, they're just basically pushing them into a corner, and they're patient. Their plan is 100 years. They don't need it done this decade or the next decade, or in our case, before the next administration or the next elections. They don't have elections. They can just patiently wait, see what happens over the next 20 years as Taiwan's livelihood is slowly eroded if they keep this confrontational approach to China. And that's what I think about that. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. America did that when, after World War II.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. That's and I often talk to some of my fellow counterparts, and I always tell them, you have to read the prize, but you also have to read a lot of other things. I said, we look at the world, and I think this is something that can benefit a lot of people just from a perspective, much like what you were talking about, cultural history. And ours is so young here in the U.S. that we forget that there are centuries of history throughout the world. and I think that's that. And I think that's what really gets some people in the like, well, we're this and we're that. But at the end of it all, the bigger portion of it, it kind of sounds, and maybe this, and Daniel's back on, so maybe we can get his finish his question real quick. But it sounds like the and maybe I'm misappropriating the word, but with Taiwan and with China, that's kind of like a bit of a Guanxi thing there, because it's like they're saving face to an extent. They're not giving face, but they're saving some face because of the political aspects of it. But at the end of the day, one of them is going to extract more benefit than anything else from that particular circumstance.
Yeah, that whole China-Taiwan dynamic is just really complex. So China's really kind of got the carrot and the stick thing. So
it's a tough one.
Taiwan has a lot of economic benefits for being friendly with China. In fact, their most recent election, the people who were more kind of separatists, they lost. In the most recent election, it's just like we had the November elections here, and a lot of Democrats won back a lot of House seats. It happened in Taiwan, where a lot of people who are more pro-one China, they won more kind of district seats than the people who are more kind of progressive and they want to be kind of separate from China. So it's just a big political situation. But yeah, you're right. There's a lot of opportunities in a lot of these underdeveloped countries for infrastructure, oil and gas, energy. That's where it's all at.
It's that, and I see that more and more. And like I said, I still pay attention because that was my first job. And, I still read what I got, it's habit, you learn. And when you look at all that tonnage going through some of those ports, I'm like, well, what is that? Then you just start digging into it. Now it's much easier now than waiting for the, Department of Commerce to send you something. But at the end of the day, I was always so fascinated by it. I said, what is going on? And then more and more, then you become a little bit more, educated in what you're doing as, from a regulatory standpoint, and you start reading a lot more why you're developing particular policies. But I think at the end of it all, from the current circumstance of these 90 days, and this is to end this, and then we can get back to Daniel's question, is I'm going to find it very, and I'm not a pessimistic person, but I would find it hard for anyone with just with the small amount that you discussed with us today about the Guanxi, that there's very little face being given by the current administration to the Chinese government. I think that would make such a difference in the negotiation part of it, or at least just the courtesy part of it. And again, my interaction was so limited with CNOC, but at the end of it all, it was the courtesy that you had to extend, not had to, but the courtesy that you must present was so extraordinary that you needed to be very cognizant of it and as genuine as you could be. But again, that was more so anything that I took from that from those interactions, and those happened at least twice a year. And it's hard to tell somebody who invested. I mean, I think it was like 500 million in one of our, and that's just for one area, to say, yeah, we're not doing too good right now. The natural gas that you thought you were going to be able to export, yeah, that's not going to be available to you until another 10 years. It's a lot.
Yeah, so I'm just going to make a quick comment. We'll get to Daniel's question. So
yeah, because I want to hear what Daniel.
I never want to get into kind of politics with any of these.
No. It's more of just a cultural aspect of it.
Well, I want you to notice one thing. So I actually, I have a podcast, and one of my early podcasts.
I didn't know that.
One of the early podcasts that I did this podcast really early, and the title of the podcast is Donald Trump is Chinese. Okay, and what I described in the podcast is actually Donald Trump understands Chinese culture better than most of us because he's a businessman and he does things based on Guanxi, which is if you're not in his graces, you're out of his graces, and that's almost like the way the Chinese people do business. And one thing that you will notice is Donald Trump is always critical of China stealing technology and trade imbalance and currency manipulation, but he never says anything negative about the president.
Oh, no.
He never says anything about the president, which basically he always gives President Xi a way out, a face-saving way to not take personal responsibility for whatever America is dissatisfied with. And I think that is just super, super intelligent for him in negotiating with the Chinese. And I'll just leave it at that. So Daniel, go ahead. Before you got cut off, what were you saying?
Yeah, sorry, I was on my phone. My phone died. But just to your point, and again, I was listening to what you were saying, and it made me think of when I listened to Trump. And I'm not getting political here, but he does always say, and I would like to thank President Xi for his help. And I hear him say that a lot. And I remember when he first went to China, it seemed like President Xi put a huge ceremony on for him. At least that's what it looked like from, when I was watching the videos of it. It was a big celebration and very well decorated. So yeah, it's just an observation. But my question was, when they give you a compliment, like you said, they will shower you with compliments or potentially, gifts or whatever. I've never been, so I don't know. But is that them reaching out for Guanxi? Is that the first step? So they expect reciprocal sort of. Okay, so it's an opportunity. If they reach out to you, you see it as Guanxi opportunities and then reciprocate.
It's actually a reflex. So when you're meeting Chinese people for the first time, they will behave that way by default. So your key to success is not to interpret that either positively or negatively. Don't let your emotions be affected by the exchange of reciprocity and goodwill. The gifts, the compliments, the catering, the dinners, okay? Don't let that affect your judgment on whether you can align on process. Okay. Because the Chinese do that to everybody when they meet them for the first time. It's customary, it's cultural, it's a habit, okay? It's deeply embedded in how they were raised. And it's almost like whatever values we were taught in elementary school here, you know, maybe we were taught to, you know, sportsmanship is important, you know, it's not whether you win or lose, it's how you play the game. These were things that we were taught when we were young. The Chinese were taught something completely different. Okay. They were taught you only want to associate with people who can help you. Up until the last 10 or 15 years, nobody in China played team sports. Okay. The only people that played sports were people who were selected by the government to train for sports so they could participate in the Olympics. But the average person, there was no such thing as team sports. So that's why you're going to feel that Chinese people are kind of at these extremes. They're either extremely generous, or you feel that they're just really selfish. Okay. This is the complexity of doing business in China, because you're going to perceive, and I have this analysis called BOE, Balance of Extremes Cross-Cultural Performance Analysis. It's really understanding the context of behavior at the extremes to really decide what is the most likely scenario that you can react to, as opposed to reacting to what you perceive at the extremes. And that's just, again, another nuance or complexity of doing business in China. And what my goal is for companies to have multi-million-dollar stakes in negotiating with people in China, they should really hire somebody like me to understand things in the proper cultural context, so they don't get caught off guard, or they don't get disappointed, or they don't get stuck with this, well, why are things not moving forward? I can always explain it into the right context.
Amazing.
Yeah, so like we're all in the same boat. This is my first webinar. You guys have done 3 or 4 or 5. This is my first. So this is my product launch. I've already gotten a lot of feedback from another group that I'm in that, you know, you can't sell your course for $99. People are so that price is going up in 2 weeks when I'm going to do another launch and do more hustling to get more people on the webinar. But yeah. Yeah.
When is it starting?
Yeah.
When does your class start?
That's already started. As soon as you buy it, you'll get the module 1.
Oh, okay.
The modules are going to be released 1 a week, so you'll get immediate access to module 1. You'll get the definitive guide to cross-cultural performance mastery, which is kind of one of the things that you have to develop, the 3 pillars of crushing China. You get access to the Facebook group, where we'll have more kind of discussions where you can hear from other China experts on certain situations that are going on in China, not just my one opinion. You hopefully will get opinions from people. And, you know, my China business advisory services is, when I do executive coaching, is $500 an hour. So for people who register on this page, they can actually get 2 30-minute sessions for $99. And people who register the next 24 hours, it's like I'm following Brian's advice. I'm giving you a free 20-minute one-on-one for people who register in the next 24 hours. And then got the code ESSTM, Essential Soft Skills That Matter. you should actually have already received an email. This is all what I actually didn't want to sell you guys the course. I wanted to share with you my email sequence so you can actually see the emails coming in. You should have already received an email. Thank you for attending this webinar. And then you're going to receive one more tomorrow and one more the next day, and then basically shopping cart closed. So
cool. Well, I'm interested in it, Gene, although I probably won't be able to buy containers or anything of that nature in the, the near future. But I think that, when we first began our discussion, I remember our very first meeting that my whole goal was to do apparel to develop an industrial, lifestyle apparel line. And I know that just from the cut and sew, I have some background in that, and I have a lot of friends who are brokers, customs brokers here in the U.S. And like I said, that's where I cut my teeth at the very beginning. They're still in it. I moved on to different things. But a refresher on this is very helpful for me, and it also opens up a lot of my mind in regards to things that I'm not cognizant of all the time. And that's beneficial, I think, just throughout any time that we're dealing, because eventually with my program, I'd like to do it with multinationals, oil and gas, just to help because many people come to cut some of their teeth here in these fields, and then they send them back to wherever they are. That happens all the time. And so I do have to be much more cognizant. I used to be, but unless you do it every day, it's very difficult to put yourself back in that international mindset.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that we talk about on the course, and is really developing a mindset for China business, developing the essential soft skills that matter, and becoming a master of cross-cultural performance. That's basically what this course is all about, but it's all wrapped around crushing it in China. So even if you don't do business in China, a lot of these skills are transferable, but we really focus the case studies for helping people do business in China.
Well, I'm going to look forward to your email. I think this is going to be good for me, just so that I can know what I need to start looking for, because I will ask some of the vendors that I have relationships with here in the U.S. And it would also be good to do that RFQ that you talked about, and maybe seeing what the difference is. It may be, you never know. I won't know until I research. And this has helped me quite a bit. So I do look forward to it.
Well, that's great. So this is great. Daniel, any more last minute questions? I don't want to hold you guys got a lot of.
I want to hear your podcast. I was wondering if you could just give us the where we can find it and the name and whatnot.
All right, I'm gonna send a link. It's just basically my old website. Okay. So this is an old website that was designed by a Upwork freelancer. So I'm actually not really using this website right now. Because I'm redoing everything in a different platform. So this is my personal website. It'll give you links to all of the so some of the most recent podcasts aren't published, but you'll get access. You'll know what my YouTube channel is. You'll know what my SoundCloud account is. You'll know what my iTunes account is, and you'll be able to figure it out. I don't have all the links right here, but even if you go into iTunes and you search China Leadership Dilemma, if you search that in Apple Podcasts, you'll get access to my podcast, China Leadership Dilemma podcast.
Yeah. Cool.
China Leadership Dilemma podcast. Okay. I will look it up. Thank you.
So,
Gene, this may be this is just like a off the wall type. Where'd you grow up in Georgia, and what type of engineer are you?
I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia.
Oh, okay.
I went to Georgia Tech as a mechanical engineer.
Oh, okay.
I worked, my early part of my career was an application engineer. And then I went to China to work with manufacturers and product development engineers. I worked at Motorola, so as a key account manager at Motorola, we were working with the Motorola factory in China. We were working with Motorola suppliers all throughout Asia Pacific, Malaysia, Singapore, Korea. My first employment was with a Japanese company, so I traveled to Japan extensively. So that's my background. It's basically engineering, manufacturing, Asia Pacific. In the past 10 or 15 years, it's been all China.
Wow. Well, that's good. That's good. Who doesn't love Atlanta? So that's really nice. And then one day, whenever we have a little bit more time, I'll tell you about my Japanese stories too with the business people. This was back when it was only a fax, and young woman, I was like 21, and then when they would call you, you have to wait for the call. You're like they're looking at the phone, waiting for the call. It was funny, and then when they meet me, gigantic, big old Dolores, and then they are, and I go, these were the people that were hollering at me sometimes because it was just the opposite. I think the Japanese always thought that I was deaf, and they had to just holler at me. And then when they meet me, that's the funniest thing.
Yeah, I think we probably share some similar experience because I started working for my first Japanese company in '93.
Yeah.
We were still on a fax machine then.
We even had a telex. I mean, that was the craziest thing. And only one lady knew how to use the telex. And I'm like, wow. Because she had worked at Halliburton. Yeah. Anyway, long story, but wonderful class. I enjoy it very much. I'm going to go ahead and sign up because I do need to refresh myself because that's my goal. My goal is to start an industrial lifestyle brand. Dolores Garza. Who knows what it's going to be, but it's Petro Life.
Yeah,
I'll see you soon.
So thank you for coming. Great questions. Great talking to you guys. And I think as soon as this course is over, hopefully we'll have more opportunities to engage with each other.
Absolutely. Thanks, Gene. Right. Good to see you, Daniel.
Thanks, Daniel.
Yep. Fascinating. Thank you. Very good.
All right. Thank you, guys. Take care.
All right. See ya.
Bye-bye.